The Last Rites of Jotham Davis by LeBron Keener, based on a true event in 1927. The time of Jotham Davis' passing was near. Outside the farmhouse in which he was laying on his deathbed, friends and family were scattered about among horse-drawn wagons and a couple old tin Lizzies. All the men and women of the mountain were there, anticipating the event and preparing to comfort his wife Tressie afterward. When he was a young man, Jotham Davis was flat out mean. He had never set foot in church until later in life. The pastor could attest to that. Until he had turned his life around, he drank on a regular basis. He had been one to take the Lord's name in vain, and it had been told that he had killed a man over a poker game down in Pikeville, but no one knew this for sure. Pikeville had a bad reputation itself, and poker games and killings were happening all the time. Even the court had a reputation. Instead of trying someone convicted of murder, they focused more on whether the victim needed killing in the first place. So if Jotham Davis had indeed killed the man, no one would have remembered anyway. This had all been years ago, yet the sins of Jotham Davis' past were still looming in their minds. Jotham himself was the only person who knew whether he was a saved man. As everyone stood around in the yard, most remained quiet and somber. But there were a group of men clad in overalls and Stetson hats standing together talking quietly. As Reuben Thomas, the preacher, stepped out onto the front porch of the old whitewashed home of Jotham and Tressie Davis, the few men who were talking fell silent. Everyone looked up at the preacher, knowing what he was about to say. At 2:37, Jotham passed with Tressie by his side, he said solemnly. Lord, cast ye mercy upon his soul and take him home with you up yonder. Amen. Everyone knew that the next evening would bring Jotham Davis' wake. In the days before funeral homes was the normal place for a viewing, the body would be placed in a casket and sent back to the home where family and friends would stay all night with the body before carrying it to the church and subsequently to the graveyard for burial. This was referred to as a wake, but in these mountains it was simply referred to as sitting up. The next day the women all prepared food which they carried to the house. As they straggled in all morning and afternoon, flowers slowly began to fill in the space around Jotham's casket in the living room. The smell of roses filled the room, making the air just as corpse-like as Jotham's body itself. The women visited with Tressie Davis and comforted her when they could. However, the men, after briefly looking at Jotham's suit-clad body, returned to the yard where they remained just as they had the day before when they had been waiting for Jotham to die. When nightfall came, it was time for the men to sit up with the body of Jotham Davis. 2 or 3 men at a time would remain in the front room with the body in a solemn fashion, softly talking among themselves. Hardly ever did anyone sit up with the deceased alone. It was usually done in threes. Around midnight, when Preacher Thomas and a couple other men were in the room, the front door of the house opened. Expecting it to be a few other men to relieve them, they stood up. However, it wasn't. It was no one they even knew, and everyone knew everyone on that mountain. It appeared to be a man, I say it because at the same time it appeared not to be a man. Within the flickering light of the kerosene lamps in the room, the men could see that its hair was long, and not one area of the creature's body wasn't covered in hair. It had the shape of a man. It stood upright like a man. But this was not a man. Paying no attention to the 3 men who were watching it closely, it went straight to the casket of Jotham Davis quietly. It grabbed the side of the open casket with its hairy hands and looked upon the body as if in mourning. It stared at Jotham's embalmed ashen hands crossed over his stomach and then turned to look at his face. Slowly, quietly, it bent down face to face with Jotham Davis and stared closely at the corpse of the old man. The men watched but didn't dare speak a word. The thing just stood there and looked down remorsefully. Suddenly, the fiend let out a horrible, blood-curdling scream. Shaking the casket with its hairy hands, it began sobbing and then viciously growling. As sudden as the outburst began, it stopped. The thing grew quiet again. It stopped shaking the casket of Jotham Davis. It continued to stare downward at the body for a few moments longer before it turned around and slowly went back to the front door, which was still standing open. Quietly, it left, and the door slowly closed behind it. Brother Reuben, what was that? One of the frightened men asked the preacher. Preacher Thomas explained that what they had seen was a demon that came from hell to mourn Jotham Davis for renouncing Satan and giving his life to God. The three men walked to the front door and stepped out onto the front porch where just moments before the grotesque creature had entered the house and left. They found the other people sitting and talking as if no one had seen anything. And no one had.